Great. Hi, Scott. Welcome to episode 31. I hope you had a good summer.
Hey, Mark, it's great to be back with you. Yeah, we've had a great summer, and but we're also glad to be, back tackling the topics again here on Prescription for Better Access.
Well, there's a lot to cover, and one thing about being near Washington, the city never sleeps. I know New
Yeah,
York is known for the city that never sleeps, but there's so
yeah,
much going on with the Trump administration and with the HHS and the CDC. And of course, we're thrilled today to be able to talk about CMS. And we have with us today Jon Blum, who's the former CMS Principal Deputy Administrator and Chief Operating Officer. I've known Jon for many years. So welcome to the podcast, Jon.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's good to see you again.
Well, and I just want to set the stage real quick, if I could, that you've worked at OMB and the Senate Finance Committee, and you worked in the private sector. You've been in academia and large insurance company. But I think a bulk of your career was 9 years at spanning two different administrations that you've worked at CMS. And I think it's fair to say that you know what you're talking about, right? When it comes to CMS.
Most of the time, yes, sometimes.
Well, we're thrilled that you're here. And Scott, who is, again, knows your world a lot better with his background and everything else. I'm going to let him ask the first question today.
Good, Scott, thank you. It's good to see you, Scott, as well.
yeah. Likewise, John. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Well, listen, why don't we just dive right in then, and maybe start with a little bit of big picture discussion about the IRA. We'd be interested to hear, from your perspective and your experience as well, John. Um, what happened that in the IRA this time around, drug pricing got pulled into it, and actions were taken. There were many years, as you know,
Yeah.
where those kinds of actions had been discussed and threatened, but never really materialized. But something changed here. Can you tell us the background about that?
Sure. I mean, it's a really great question. And I think I was part of the Senate Finance Committee team back in 2003 that drafted the Part D legislation that created the Part D drug benefit. And I think there was a lot of, core message language that was put into that law, one of which being that the government doesn't have the ability to negotiate drug prices. And when you think back to that language, that was not just a kind of partisan statement, but there was bipartisan support, Democrats, Republicans, different bills, different contexts, but all wanted to give sort of the kind of core message that the government, through the Part D program, was going to purchase drug benefits through private plans. And that was really kind of a kind of core message document. But then when the Republicans, um, uh, with some Democratic support, passed the Part D bill, that phrase that was really put to the bill to really, just pure messaging, give confidence that private plans, kind of structure was going to work, that turned to be a kind of core rallying cry. And for many, many years, the Democrats, or
Right.
some Democrats, believed the Part D benefit was flawed. And even President Trump, during his first term, he also talked about the notion that the government should have the right uh, to negotiate drugs. But despite all the rhetoric, that nobody figured out how to do it, how to build it, how to structure it, really in a context where you have private plans still competing for um, for um, for for Part D drug benefits. The law doesn't change the kind of basic structure to the program, but it really brings a kind of second layer to the Part D benefit to give the government more ability to get better price. And for many years, that was a talking point. There was no bill, there was no legislation, there was no structure. But I think two things happened. One, that when the President Biden campaigned during the 2020 election, it was a core a policy platform, number one or number two on his list for things to get done to lower prices. But two, real credit goes to the Congress, but they did some really hard work to kind of translate the talking point to that kind of actual legislation. I think what changed was the work, the product to take the talking point, take the general vague notion the government shall negotiate drug prices to a program, to a law that passed, that was scored, that was paired with really other key Part D reforms. I think that's the difference, that it was campaign, election, and the pressure to kind of fulfill that in the context of kind of very narrow margins. The President Biden at the time and the Democratic-led Congress needed tangible results to demonstrate that they could govern, they could take the talking point, put it into action, and begin to do big things again with healthcare.
Well, that's great. Do you want any other questions on the IRA, Scott?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I'm going
for
to
sure.
dive into the IRA, but I mean, I'm going to get into the impact. But do you have
Yeah, yeah.
a
Okay, I
follow up?
was just being polite for you here, Mark. So,
Oh, you're very kind. I'll let you take the drug price. I'll let you take the drug pricing question.
all right. So fine. So the circumstances changed enough that government action was going to be possible. Why don't you take us a bit behind the scenes then, and tell us more about the process, the negotiations, what was on the original wish list when it came to government negotiating prices in the IRA.
I mean, I think that the bill that was passed came very close to the actual wish list. I think there were some that wanted the government to go faster, wanted more, kind of
Hmm.
more drugs negotiated, and I think that was one of the areas that was really kind of key contention. How fast, how soon, what could get done. I think from the CMS perspective, when I was there, was key tenet that we wanted to communicate to the Congress, to the White House, was this is hard work. It requires a lot of preparation, a kind of lot of detail. And so what CMS argued for was a very um, deliberate ramp up to how we think about the pace and the timing. So the law starts now with 10 drugs. Um, begins to expand to Part B covered drugs. So I think the kind of kind of area for debate was how fast, what's the
Hmm.
pace, what's the overall schedule. There were, conversations with the Hill regarding kind of which drugs should be included, which should be excluded. There were some compromises formed for what's the period for being on the market. So whenever large bills, get considered, there's always some give and take, and key constituents begin to weigh in. But I think from the overall process perspective, how the program works, how the government engages, how drug manufacturers engages. I mean, the law turned out pretty close to, I think, what was intended from the start, but that number of drugs, the which drugs get chosen,
Yeah.
those were areas that, both due to, kind of uh, uh, politics, political considerations, but also just due to the nature of the work, got some degree of
Yeah.
negotiation.
And it was interesting that the government negotiations are triggered after a period of time on market,
Yeah,
but before obviously the medicines have lost exclusivity.
yeah,
And so there's a window there. There's an earlier period where the government, I guess, stays out of it, and then a period where they intervene for preferred Part D pricing while they await exclusivity. Was that always the plan, or was there ever any thought about just having negotiating it
yeah.
up front, from the government?
I mean, there were certainly voices, throughout the process that I think wished there was a kind of faster timetable, that wished that the government would be more aggressive, that wished
Yeah,
that 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 all drugs would go through negotiation. But I think the law that passed really is a balance. I know that we want to talk more about this balance during this podcast of how we think about access, how we think about price, how we think about really creating kind of strong, um, uh, very strong incentives for innovation. And I think the law at the end of the day really is a kind of balancing to those those different tension points. And I think we can
Yeah.
always debate kind of, did the government get it right? And I suspect there will be changes to the law over time. The uh, there are a few changes to which drugs get chosen early during this most recent reconciliation bill. So I think it's part of the evolution to any major legislation that that the kind of balances get debated, they get reconsidered. And I think the end of the day, what was passed in 2022 was really a balance of different competing tensions. There were some members of Congress that come from districts that have a pretty strong pharmaceutical presence, and I think they had
Yeah.
concerns regarding the pace. And there were some who have long championed more price negotiation that were disappointed that the law didn't go faster and um, be be more aggressive.
Well, the industry, as you know, had a lot of response to various individual details. I'll just pick one: the small
Yeah.
molecule exclusivity period versus the large. And but was there anything in there that ultimately surprised you, John?
I think what surprised me most was, we can talk more about this during the conversation, was how um, how much the bill came together and how the process worked once the bill was passed. I think many of us at CMS were there during the time when the ACA was passed, and we saw some of the challenges with the implementation. And I think, to the full credit to the CMS team that is largely still at CMS today, they delivered. And I think what was a very kind of good surprise was just how much both stakeholders came to the
Hmm.
table to help support the implementation, even those that 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 didn't support the legislation, from manufacturers to stakeholders to consumer groups. And I think the most surprising thing, but I shouldn't say a surprise because the CMS team is very, very good, that
Sure.
the law went forward without a hitch, and that CMS uh, secured 10 deals. We weren't always confident we were going to get to that place, but to me, it was the delivery, the execution, and from just getting it done, that it was flawless.
That's
Well,
great.
thanks for the overview.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to turn now to sort of the impact that the IRA is going to have, especially as the impact on the beneficiaries and the Part D sort of plans, right?
Yeah.
Those two areas. And I know for calendar year 2026, the Part D redesign program instructions has already been sort of issued. And from your perspective, whether it's cost sharing, out of pocket, the design, what do you see as the impact on the beneficiaries and the Part D plans?
Yeah, it's a really important question because um, the law that was passed did a couple things at the same time. Number one, that it put in place the ability for the government to negotiate in a very structured way. Number two, that it changed the cost sharing structure uh, for how the Part D benefit works. And the Part D benefit, going back to 2003 when it was passed by Congress, wasn't built to be a kind of perfect pharmaceutical benefit, but it was built to kind of solve some defined uh, uh, budget parameters. Um, the law also puts in place for the first time a catastrophic cap, so beneficiaries that have high drug costs uh, will get protection. And so, from that standpoint, what the Part D benefit changes have produced is a different distribution for who benefits the most from the Part D drug benefit. And it really now is designed to help those who have chronic illness and who have very high drug costs, who have a cancer diagnosis. And so I think the challenge will be, going forward, that those that will benefit from the Part D drug benefit, meaning the cost sharing changes the catastrophic coverage, m- might not be people that are kind of paying for the benefit in year one, meaning that the Part D program has become a kind of much more important um, catastrophic protector insurance system. And so the Congress has changed the distribution for who benefits from the Part D program. And it might be that people that benefit the most will be those 2, 5, 10 years out. And so I
Right.
think that's going to be a real challenge for CMS and the federal government to really um, uh, uh, articulate the benefits that are tremendous, but not every beneficiary is going to see benefits during the first year, during the second year. It's really going to depend to their drug mix, um, to the degree they have a very high cost illness or kind of high cost event. So that that was a challenge that we really thought hard about during our time putting in place the kind of the first few pieces of the law.
Yeah, last year we had a guest who said that it should have been front page news in terms of the impact of what the IRA has or will do for seniors, as you mentioned, the catastrophic as well as the sort of the cost sharing. Related to that, diving in a little bit of detail, I know it's called the IRA's Medicare Prescription Payment Plan, the M3P. Could you share more information about the M3P and what the expectations are for the uptake of that particular program?
So I think part of the goal again was to for the laws change to really help people who have higher drug costs. I think there's one group of Part D users that have persistently high drug costs, and throughout time, throughout the year, meaning that they're taking a a drug consistently that has uh, a, a high price, and due to the Part D benefit designs, they could pay kind of high cost share during January, February, but that smooths out to a kind of very low cost relative during the last 2, 3 months of the year. So what Congress did in this provision was to give beneficiaries the option to really smooth it out. So they're paying consistently January, February, March throughout time. But the way the benefit was constructed, the way that the kind of finances work is that for those beneficiaries who have kind of low drug costs, they're taking mostly generics, they're not going to benefit from this program, but it's really those who are taking kind of consistent high cost drugs consistently throughout the year that that will benefit most. And so again, this is a kind of challenge for the government, challenge for CMS to really articulate this program because it is voluntary that beneficiaries choose to sign up for it. They have to sign up for it early in order to get the full benefits.
Right.
That kind of one strategy that's now in place for pharmacists at the point of sale to help talk about the program, but as we know, that pharmacies tend to be busy and they tend not to necessarily have the time. So I
Right.
think this is going to be a program that that drug manufacturers will have to help promote. That Part D plans will have to help promote pharmacists, and beneficiary advocates that work with patients. But not all Part D beneficiaries will benefit from the program, but just certain beneficiaries that have drug costs that kind of follow this like high cost spike during the first months of the year that then trend downward. If a beneficiary signs up, um, they could they could pay more, and so it's a real communication challenge, but also a very important financial benefit.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, if I could, I just want to turn to the sort of the Part D plans and sort of their perspective on all of this, and how is CMS monitoring or guarding against the Part D plans and how they might game the system?
That one of the issues that we have to watch carefully, that we have to watch closely, is how the standalone Part D plans fare through this next several years. I'm not sure this Marcus is going to answer your question, but that Congress knew that the costs of the the complete changes would have kind of much higher costs and savings during the early years because the drug negotiation savings don't really kick into year 3, 4, 5, 6, but there are costs up front due to the benefit design changes. And so there's a kind of a actuarial balance that has to be solved to ensure that Part D plans don't have too much higher cost during the early years to ensure Part D premiums remain affordable. So Congress added into the law what's called the Part D Stabilization Fund to give more subsidy protection to Part D plans. But the way it was constructed was that the Part D subsidy doesn't go to each plan separately, but it's more macro. And, uh, and so the way the math is working is that the Part D standalone plans have the most financial challenge. Those plans serve those beneficiaries that have chosen traditional Medicare to get their Part A, Part B services. I think we have a real challenge going forward to ensure that the standalone Part D plans stay affordable. Beneficiaries can get their drug benefits through either standalone plans or uh, a comprehensive plan. The standalone plans, I think we have to really watch carefully. I suspect that Congress may have to come back to the program to think through how to stabilize that part of the program to ensure that all Part D plans, the MA plans, but also the standalone Part D plans, continue to be affordable.
Yeah, I'll just turn to one of the manufacturer potential concerns. Some of the colleagues that Mark and I have in the industry have expressed worry for products that have undergone now the MFP negotiation, that they may actually um, become targets for increased utilization management. I'll say from
Uh-huh.
the plans, uh, because we all understand the importance of the rebates here, and the negotiation changes that so that there isn't really a rebate now that accrues to the it's a net price instead, and so some of the manufacturers expressed worry that even though formulary coverage is required, that they may be disadvantaged through cost sharing or more subtle utilization management techniques. John, do you think that's a real worry? And if so, how will that be monitored and managed?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly heard the arguments uh, during my time at CMS, and I think this is some
Yeah,
of the areas that the drug manufacturer asked CMS to look at to see if we had flexibility to somehow um, uh, guarantee formulary drug placement. Um, but the law was structured in a way that didn't give CMS the ability to to protect manufacturers from the kind of Part D plan behavior. I think for the entire Part D program, that there is a huge obligation to CMS and to all stakeholders to really um, kind of track what happens going forward. And again, going back to the statement that the Part D law that was passed was really a compromise for how to balance competing tensions. And if it turns out that some of those balances weren't correct, that Congress got it wrong, CMS got it wrong for how it carried out the law, there should be a very strong foundation for us to assess. Now, starting this fall, we'll see the first formularies coming out of the first round of
yeah.
the first 10 drugs that will give us some indication. Do we see barriers? Do we see certain patient restrictions? But I think there's an obligation on the government, CMS, to track, to really define what are the key measures that matter from an access, from an innovation, from a kind of overall cost perspective. And if it turns out that the the overall market changes are kind of beyond what was intended, there should be a pathway for us to go back into the law to address and to adjust. But But unfortunately, in our process, we don't craft laws that way. We have to come back and we have to find the political capital in order to change the law. But I think in the interim, there is an obligation to CMS today. There is an obligation on all stakeholders, manufacturers, plans, etc., to really track, to report, to collaborate, to share information, and chances are that some of those balances need to be reconsidered to ensure patients have what they need, to ensure that the program remains sustainable, to ensure we have competition, to ensure that we have choices for Part D plans, particularly for those that choose to receive their core benefits through the traditional Medicare program. But um, in large part, we have to wait for the data to materialize, and then I think we have to begin to make those assessments.
So this is another kind of seen so out of IRA now, but another CMS policy area that some of our audience members and others are interested in. But it's coverage with evidence development,
Mhm.
John. And I'd just be interested in sort of your overall sense of how that program has been going. Obviously, it was an important consideration with the approval of the new Alzheimer's treatments and some of the controversy around that. And there was an intent to kind of balance, the uncertainties with the size of the population and the price and the potential spending, and to try to shoehorn it through this coverage with evidence development. Um, and there's this logic to that, I guess, on the one hand. On the other hand, in practice, in the real world, we've heard a lot of complaints that the process is too complicated and it leads to less uptake. It ends up with it's hard for the doctors and for the patients to enroll
Yeah,
in some of the trials, and so we get both less coverage and less evidence development. And so I'm just wondering what the future of that program might look like. Um, from your view.
it's a great question. I think it's very timely still. Um, you kind of start by saying several points. Number one, I think we have to have a kind of honest discussion of kind of how does CMS think about coverage for any product, be it pharmaceutical, be it medical device, be it surgical, etc. When the drug or the device procedure is promising, yet there's not sufficient evidence for us to feel confident regarding granting uh, 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 full full coverage. On kind of one end of the spectrum, you would say, well, CMS should cover anything that is determined safe by the FDA. The other end says that that CMS should be a very prudent purchaser to ensure that its tax dollars are kind of uh, spent wisely. And so I think to me, CED really is a kind of compromise position, a kind of balancing different tension positions for how the government, how CMS, how the Medicare program should think about coverage when you don't have full confidence, when there are legitimate questions regarding whether our drug works and that it works better than the current line therapy, and that's true for devices, that's true for surgical procedures, etc. So then I think the question is kind of how do you define CED going forward? And so I think you can define CED as requiring very strict, rigorous controlled trials. And I am very sympathetic to the argument uh, that manufacturers kind of went through that hurdle when they got the approval from the FDA. But you can also think about CED as quite simple as submitting data to a national health registry, and as part of the CED decision that we did um, for the Alzheimer's drugs was to build a very simple to use, a, 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 a free of charge uh, uh, um, registry that then could be paired with uh, CMS claims data, which to our minds at the time was, viewed as very easy to use, low cost, um, and consistent with the treatment for how physicians track their patients, etc. I think we can think about CED in the form of very complex controlled trials, or we can think about CED to say, well, let's just
Mhm.
continue to collect data and be able to make better decisions for the future. And so I think the thing that I think about is that if we didn't have CED as an option, particularly for drugs, devices, uh, surgical procedures, there is legitimate questions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you go to full coverage, but it could mean that you go the other extreme to say, we're not going to cover it. And so I do think that those that do criticize CED need to also think about the alternatives and to say, well, that CMS has the legal right not to cover something. And so that really, I think, is a choice for kind of how we go forward in a world where we have breakthrough potential technologies, drugs, devices, etc., but also legitimate questions regarding the evidence. How do we move forward? There are certainly voices that would say CMS cover as long as the FDA says that it's safe. Other voices that would say CMS should not cover because that would be a huge waste of the tax dollars. So I think we do have to find balances. I think CED is not perfect in its current form, but could be formed in a way that really creates a kind of much easier pathway to navigate, create
Mhm.
surety that once the kind of evidence barrier was defined, was proven, that it does move to full coverage. I think there's some ways that we can reform it, make it work better, but not throw it out because um, that CMS of the future could decide to go to the other extreme and say, well, we're not going to cover anything that doesn't meet certain requirements. But I think, to me, it's really a balance and a compromise between two competing visions.
Do you think, and so now I got a lot of things go through my mind as I listen to that. Um, the companies, generally have enough input from the FDA that they can understand kind of what they need to hit in their
Yeah,
trials in order to prove safety and efficacy for a regulatory review. They don't have that when they're dealing with
yeah.
payment from CMS and so on. And so I guess it makes me wonder, like, well, maybe there needs to be some corollary at CMS that says, well, this is going to be our bar or whatever. But anyway, I can only imagine the political process to figure that out.
Yeah, but I think the hard part too, I think this needs more consideration, is only a very small fraction of services, drugs,
Yeah.
devices, procedures go through the Medicare coverage process. The vast majority of coverage decisions really happen at the local level and kind of happen below the CMS fray. And so I think there are some unique cases I think we have to define better for the future that are truly breakthrough, that are truly kind of questions for kind of what is the evidence. Those There probably a strong argument that CMS National needs to consider those because the local process just can't support those. I think we have to define that better. I think, to Scott, to your point, we have to define what is the pathway better. We have to define kind of what is the endpoint to CED. How do we
Hmm.
know that it's proven? We haven't kind of ever tested that notion yet.
Yeah.
Nothing covered through CED really has graduated off of CED yet. So I think there's some huge questions that need to be addressed. And I think we also need to recognize that only a small fraction of
Yeah.
the overall
Well,
coverage
this one
decisions.
obviously
Yeah,
became a big deal because it was Alzheimer's
yeah,
disease,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
And so then just one more on that. So now, as I'm sure you've seen, Leqembi has headlined that they've got better 3-year data now, that the efficacy, the improvements continue. Um, any sense on, what should happen now or what will happen now with reimbursement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the coverage decision for Leqembi was uh, designed to be flexible. If there is new evidence, the CMS has the right, and I would argue CMS also has the obligation
Yeah.
to reopen the coverage decision. And so I think that I believe, and I think hopefully the agency continues to believe that these are really dynamic processes. And as evidence
Yeah.
improves, the coverage decision should also improve. I think we need to kind of also ask the question for kind of breakthrough drugs and breakthrough devices. Do we continue to collect data evidence that's only going to make the program work better, going to make access work better? But hopefully the agency continues to believe that there is a dynamic process that adjusts as new evidence becomes available.
I want to turn to John and I both live in the DC area, and you can't
Yeah.
turn on the TV without seeing an ad for whether it's a manufacturer, whether it's PBMs, whether it's payers. All of them are sort of like attacking each other. And Scott and we have this podcast, right? And our podcast was created because of, there's so many competing dynamics. We've had at the beginning, Dr. Robinson called it the war of all against all, right? So we know this is going on, but it's created this dynamic of blame, right? Like the blame dynamic. So I want to turn to that real quickly. Why is there so much of this blame and so little recognition that that there's a lot of this is system generated incentives that lead to this war of all against all? And what is your perspective on what we can do to sort of balance all this and hopefully find a path forward?
I'm not sure I have a good answer to your question, but I think it's the right question. I mean, again, I think back to the 2003 experience of kind of how the Part D drug benefit came together. And again, there were different points of view regarding Democrats and Republicans for how the program should cover um, Part D benefits and costs. But I think what was true was the industry really came together and said that we want to work together to offer a program that had manufacturers, PBMs, health plans all working together to offer a kind of notion um, of competition that would lower costs, that would give beneficiaries choices. I don't know precisely how we got to a world where there was more collaboration, there was more consensus building, to a world where there is more kind of finger pointing. And I think that kind of one of the reasons might be that back in 2003, Congress worked hard to pass legislation that would get 60 votes in the Senate. And now we're at
Mm.
a point where there's no longer kind of 60 vote margins. There's no longer the ability to build coalitions, but now the kind of the game is to pass legislation through 51 vote, kind of slim majorities uh, through reconciliation. So everyone is trying to get sort of jockeying for um, kind of for leverage within that environment, where I think in the past the sort of incentive was to jockey for consensus, to build a coalition, to make sure you could pass something through 60 votes. But over time, you've gone into a world where that you just need 51 votes, and that's often single party, which then I think creates um, the kind of finger pointing, that creates the blame, that creates the need to kind of jockey for more leverage. I think that's kind of one sort of response mark to your question, kind of for how we got to a point today.
Mm.
Two, I think I don't know that our kind of political process really understands the complexities for how people navigate kind of healthcare. And I think one of the things that I saw um, working for Care First Blue Cross for a few years between CMS stents was just how kind of fluid the health insurance system is, and how fragile coverage is, and how often people change carriers, change their drug prior authorizations, needs to navigate this constantly churning healthcare system that we operate in. Which I think if policymakers really kind of recognized that how much complexity the average consumer goes through in order to maintain their health insurance benefits. And
Right.
it's not like the OPM system where you keep your health insurance for for many, many years. I think if we had more kind of recognition to the complexity of how kind of consumers um, navigate their coverage, there would be more demands for the healthcare system to work together to kind of solve the complexity, stop the finger pointing, kind of solve issues. But I also think kind of how Congress passes laws today compared to how it passed laws 15, 20 years ago creates much more of the shocking kind of competitive nature of policy discussions and those kind of jockeying for leverage.
Yeah. Well, we continue to be strong advocates that at some point we have to move beyond the status quo,
Yeah,
right? Like some of the incentives are so great that they just now everybody's just embedded in them, and all
yeah,
they're doing is they're defending what they have, as opposed to, like you said,
Yeah.
looking at how patients and others are really impacted by all of
yeah,
this.
Well, exactly right, Mark. And just the last discussion with John about the Alzheimer's drugs and CED is it, the language he used, which is appropriate, which is like, hey, there's a balance here between, you know, all the competing objectives,
Right.
supporting innovation, rushing therapies to desperate patients who need them, but also managing the costs of the government and the taxpayers and all those kinds of things. And so this is, this is what we go through. And I, as somebody who doesn't live in DC like you guys, I get frustrated as an outsider kind of watching and listening to the conversation, and they dumb it down to like, oh, it's just price gouging, or it's just middleman excesses, or it's just, whatever. And
Right.
I wonder oftentimes, like, do they really think that, which strikes me as odd. These are smart people who are, you know, they may not get all the complexity, John, but they're exposed to a lot of it and they understand the world's complicated and all that. Or is it just easier to, and maybe politically even more expedient to sort of play the blame game? Do you have a
yeah.
perspective on that?
It's a good question. I used to kind of ask the CMS team to make sure that they were getting out to um, really experience the healthcare system. I live in a town
Hmm.
uh, called Tacoma Park. That's a very diverse community. I remember when my daughter was 2, my wife sending me to the CVS to uh, get her medicine. The daughter was crying. Went to the CVS in the middle of the night, and I couldn't believe like how many people were there at 2 o'clock in the morning, but also how many people were um, walking away from the counter, not getting their drug. They couldn't afford the $5 copayment, the $10
Yeah.
copayment. I do think that if we were to kind of spend time in delivery systems, healthcare settings that are dealing with challenge, um, uh,
Makes sense.
volunteering, working in, really observing what a fully qualified health center goes through, I think that policymakers would be more demanding that stakeholders need to work together, whether it's on the pharmaceutical side, the technology side, the healthcare delivery
Hmm.
side. But I think we all have to really make a point to spend time in how consumers receive their care, navigate healthcare benefits, how many walk away from the prescription
Yeah.
counter because they can't afford a $5, $10 copayment with the baby in tow and the baby is screaming because they can't get access to the medicines. Um, I think once we'd spend more time and really kind of observe, that I think we would be less tolerant of uh, the ads we're seeing, the finger pointing that's going on, and the choosing sides.
If we could, I'd like to turn to the future a little bit, and Scott, if there's anything else you want to cover. Um, but when you look ahead, you know, you've been again, you were the number 2 at CMS. You've been in 2 different administrations. Um, so you've again had very different roles. But what major policy or regulatory shift do you foresee shaping the drug pricing landscape next? And we'll let go broad. PBM
Yeah.
reform. There's a lot of that. Antitrust action. International reference pricing, value-based pricing, we'll let you. So what do you see sort of policy wise, or regulatory wise, coming up in the future?
More pessimistic on us seeing kind of new legislation in the short term.
Mm,
Congress has just passed a kind of massive change to tax and Medicaid benefits, and I think um, that was a very kind of wrought process that has kind of bruised different stakeholders, different coalitions. So I'm more pessimistic today than I was maybe 2 or 3 months ago that we're going to see kind of new legislation in the next 1 to 2 years. What I do think that we're going to see is a renewed conversation regarding health insurance premiums. And I think we're about to see, not just in the Medicare program,
yeah.
but in those that purchase through the state-based exchanges, the federal exchanges, those that receive coverage through their employers, so they're going to see some pretty substantial premium changes going into the next several years. There's many factors why that is, but I think the net consumer impact will be higher premiums, higher costs for just the coverage they have today, which
Yeah.
then begins to pose the question, well, how should health insurance coverage change for the future, and how should we begin to think about what's the role of healthcare insurance? And I am much more optimistic that I think we will have a kind of broader conversation for how we cover things like cell and gene therapies. And should the insurance system in its current form continue to insure for tremendously breakthrough, tremendously narrow technologies? Um, but that's not what the health insurance necessarily is designed to do. Should the health insurance system continue to pay for low-cost generic drugs that can be purchased oftentimes cheaper out of pocket than through the traditional insurance system? I do think the financial pressures that consumers will soon feel going into 2026, 2027, I think will begin to kind of bring forward questions for what should insurance cover? Should we think about other financing
Hmm.
mechanisms, particularly for high-cost breakthrough technologies that only serve a relatively small number of people? Should things that are common, routine, very inexpensive, continue to flow through the insurance system? I think that's where I feel um, not not optimistic for kind of families' financial health, but I think optimistic that we will see renewed interest in kind of challenging some of the conventions. Mark, I think to the earlier point of bringing stakeholders together to solve cost challenges, access challenges, financing challenges, but I do think we're going to see some tremendous financial pressure put on individuals, put on families that I think will renew conversations regarding the affordability, the purpose for insurance, and what we have to go through in order to get access.
On
Yeah.
that note, I'm sorry to step on you, Scott, but
No, please.
is it ever possible? You talk about cell and gene. You talk about. Is it ever possible for the government to create a catastrophic plan, like a catastrophic umbrella for that could be, somehow government backed or government funded?
I think so. I think it's a question that has to be considered. And I think that would take a lot of pressure off employer plans.
Yeah.
Particularly in this world where we have the patient, kind of changing health insurance plans very often,
Yeah,
going into Medicaid, coming off of Medicaid, their employer changes coverage. I think particularly for the under 65 population, we're going to have to think about um, financing systems where the cost really is, kind of spent year one, but the benefits, the the impact really is in year 2, 3, 5, year 10,
right.
10, 20, et cetera. So um, that to me argues that the kind of annual nature to how we price health insurance benefits, can't support some of the new therapies that are on market, that are coming on market, that really have this multi-year cost, but also impact.
Okay, well, John, thanks again for
Thank you.
joining us today. We always wrap with the same question for all of our guests. We give you the magic wand, and we ask if you could do anything you want. And I don't know what higher role that would be than the one that you've already been
Yeah.
had, but what would you do? What would be your prescription for better access?
My prescription would be, I think it goes to this question um, that we were just talking about for how we work better together as a healthcare
Yeah,
system, to really better assign roles, better assign checks and balances, and uh, take away friction from people. And so I think um, uh, one kind of area that we didn't talk about is kind of how much time that a family has to spend to navigate prior authorization processes. How much time does the Medicare beneficiary have to spend to choose which Part D plans
yeah,
be best for them each year? And so I do think there's this notion that we have to begin to quantify the time, the stress, the challenge that we're asking consumers to make, and then begin to identify ways to give that stress or take away that stress, to give back time to people. And so I think to me, it's less about passing laws, but it's more about really understanding the time, the stress, the energy, the, the complications that we ask people to go through each year, and begin to identify ways to take it away.
good. That's a good one. Thanks.
That's great. That's great. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us. I realize that I did not mention what your current role is. Do you want to just tell us a minute,
Yeah,
take a second on what you're currently doing?
yeah, doing several things. One is that I'm consulting and uh, doing some doing some consulting work with some great companies. I've become a non-resident scholar with the USC Schaefer Institute, which gives me the opportunity to do some policy research. I've joined some boards and I have joined some state commissions. I'm really trying to balance my time of consulting, think tanking, serving on boards, but also to continue government service.
Well, thank you for your government service, and thank you for what you've done, and thank you for what you continue to do. And hopefully, maybe in that think tank, you can help incubate this catastrophic plan that
All
we
right,
could
awesome.
someday roll out in next time in a future administration.
All right,
Well,
awesome.
Scott, do you want to sort of and John, bear with us. We take a minute to wrap
Yep.
up the episode and sort of highlights lessons learned. Any key things for you?
Yeah, I'll be brief. But I was just struck. We've had a lot of conversations with guests here where the highlight was the complexity of the medical insurance,
Right,
management system, and I was just struck by the analogy there with the government processes or whatever that there are all these competing objectives. Folks generally understand that, but sometimes it's easier to dumb it down and play the blame game or whatever. And but it's hard to strike the right balance, and it's getting harder. Moreover, and so efforts like coverage with evidence development, or efforts to do that, compromises in the MFP or in the IRA, or efforts to do that or whatever. And we can debate, like, as John was saying, did we get it just right, or did it need to be
right.
adjusted, and all that kind of thing. But then the other worry was just that in the current political environment, that's getting harder to do. Not and and our need is to make it easier to do. And so anyway, we're gonna have to work on that, Mark.
Well, no doubt. I would just add that you know me, like I love the human side of John, right? Like the fact that he's been a parent and like these are situations where it's not people sitting in a room. The joke in Washington is sometimes that legislation is written by the 24-year-old who has joined the politician's staff or and has no experience with the world. You can hear in John how the human side, like
Yeah.
what it's like to be a patient or a parent, or has come through in policy,
Yeah.
and things like, again, what it's doing for patients, Medicare beneficiaries who have real high cost drugs, and how they're going to make a difference with catastrophic caps and spread out the payments. Those things are very human, make a difference on the ground floor for patients. And
Yeah.
I just love seeing that. So,
Yeah.
so with that, Jon, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We're
Thank you.
thrilled to have you. And thank you again to my partner, Scott Howe, for joining me on this, joining me in as he and I take on this journey of trying to improve access and affordability. Uh, and thank all for our listeners. We have reached over 1,000 listeners and downloads every month, so we're thrilled with that. And we didn't know there were 1,000 people out there interested in what we do, but we're thrilled to be reached that level. And thank you again for joining us on episode 31 of Prescription for Better Access.